Hello everyone and welcome to my 5.3 Imaginarium Theater video. It's not a guide, it's just a video, it's a playthrough of me doing Imaginarium Theater, and I hope that is helpful in itself. I didn't want to do a guide because there's so much to Imaginarium Theater, like so many different enemies you can come across, different fights you can have, different team comps you can take into those chambers, different buffs you can have while doing it. That doing a really comprehensive, in-depth guide would not only be exhausting for me, but probably for you to watch as well. So this is just a playthrough, and I want to give some helpful tips throughout to try and help you understand how to approach the situation, rather than specific things to make it work. I will try to get all the stars using a 4-star only run, but if I can't, then it doesn't matter. I'm just going to absolutely get all of the rewards, because stars don't make a difference unless you want to flex to someone on HoYoLab about it, which, who's going to do that, right? And if you haven't noticed already, I'm not going to be editing the audio as much. There's going to be a lot more ums and ahs and pauses. It's just going to be much more awkward generally, but a lot less YouTube enunciation, weird voice stuff. So I hope that's fine. As I said, I definitely still want to make this video educational and give advice where I can. So if you are struggling with Imaginarium Theater or want some general tips for it, this might still be helpful for you. So let's talk about the setup that I'm going to be using. 4 stars only, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to do it on visionary mode, so the hardest difficulty where you take 22 characters. I can luckily do it this time just because of the certain elements, meaning that I've got enough characters for it, and also having access to the guest stars, letting me get 2 more. The only exception to this is being the opening characters. Everyone is forced to take certain 5-star opening characters, 3 of them. So I'm going to allow myself to use those, but I'm going to use the ones everyone has access to, the trial versions of them. So I won't be using my own artifacts or weapons for any of that. As far as the 4-star characters, anything goes really for them. I'm just only allowed to use 4-star weapons. That's a bit annoying for me. As you will see, some of the weapons aren't level 90. Some of the characters aren't properly leveled either, because I haven't done that for everyone. Also, I have a lot of 5-star weapons, so I normally put them on my 4 stars instead. But because of that, that means some of these characters don't have great weapons on them. I think like Heizo has a level 70 weapon or something. But artifact-wise, they're fairly well invested, and talent-wise, they're all at least level 6 talents, I think. If you do notice some 4-star artifact sets, that's probably because it's Instructors, which is just a really good buffing set for elemental reactions, because it gives you a lot of elemental mastery when you trigger a reaction, and it gives it to your whole team. So especially in Abyss like this, that's kind of focused on vaporize reactions, it's just a good artifact set to take in spite of it being a 4-star. You also see a lot of Favonius weapons. That's just because Favonius weapons are really good generally, especially in teams when you're not sure what characters you're taking and whether you need the energy. It's useful to have excess energy on those characters, so Favonius helps with that. As well as that, not all of my characters are the best they can be. I have like a C5 Garming and not a C6, and C6 makes a huge difference. Same with Auron, they're only C4. And lastly, I'm not borrowing a character for this run. If you are doing this and you are struggling, borrow a character. Borrowing a character can like freely pass you 2 chambers just by having a really well invested, especially if you can borrow one with Constellation's 5-star character like Moika or Chaska or Arakino. They will just breeze through 2 chambers for free for you. It doesn't even really matter what the supports are. If you want some friends to add to do that, there's Reddit threads, you can check my Discord server, there's all kinds of places where you can find, you can just add people from the friends list, from the co-op, just randomly. Go have a look at the characters. If they have a good character you want to borrow, just add them. You should do whatever you can to get all the rewards in this game. No one's gonna stop you from doing that. Lastly, I also cut out some of the retries I did of some of the chambers. I didn't do all of this first time and didn't figure it out first time. Take your time with it, retry chambers, rewind if you need to, right? Okay, so let's talk about some of the tactics I'm using in this chamber. So first of all, the characters I normally pick at the start are characters I don't really care about. As it goes, the first couple of chambers I found to be really easy, or at least the easiest of the ones you face later down the line, and you don't have to think about them as much, which means I will generally be taking characters I want to get rid of. Also, grouping characters like Venti, Sucrose, Kazuha are really useful in the early chambers. In fact, there's quite a lot of chambers where it'll be like, these characters are easy to group. So if I can take those characters, I do, because it makes a huge difference to the damage you do if you're able to hit multiple enemies at once with abilities. Quickly, just to touch on the enemies in the first chamber, I tried this a few times and I found the ground ruin drakes, the robot ones, to be the easiest to fight. I just ended up fighting these because I didn't have any other options, so I just took a lot of grouping and pirate application to deal with all the slimes. I also, as you saw, took a bunch of mystery caches. If I had the option to take mystery caches, I always took them because they generally are beneficial and are free. On top of that, they reset all the available cards, which means if you're looking for something else, like a character selector or a buff, then take the free mystery cache and you'll have different access. You'll have access to different ones next time. Then onto this chamber. This chamber, I'm fighting two of those creatures, the lava avatars of lava, and they self-infuse with pyro, which means any characters that do hydro application just get free vaporizers against them. I kind of wanted to save Xinqiu for later, because he's a really strong character, and so I save him if I can, versus using the weaker characters earlier. But I didn't have enough damage with the rest of the characters I had, and so I end up using Xinqiu here to get a really easy clip. On top of that, you might have seen earlier me skip Auroron as an option to pick. Even though he's a really strong character, I don't want to pick Auroron yet, because I want to use other characters, and I want to save Auroron for when I'm facing the Papilla later, because he's going to solve that for me. Okay, so we're now on to the first boss battle, the Climactic Showdown. And so I pick up some buffs to help me with that. I've found that the Vaporize buff just is really, really helpful when you have a selection of the characters you have, because most of them will be Pyro or Hydro characters vaporizing to get the most out of their damage rather than running mono or Animo versions of certain teams. Especially for me, because 4 stars, there's very limited Hydro options. I really needed to make the best use of those characters. So for this chamber, the biggest thing is that you can group those enemies. They are not bosses, they're elites, which means with enough CC, you can kind of hold them in place. And by CCing them, not only do you allow yourself to get more damage on them more easily, but more than that, it stops them acting, it stops them doing damage. I will let generally the gameplay speak for itself sometimes, but I'll try to point out things that I did for a specific reason. Here, I'm just trying to I'm trying to group them, and then proc the Vaporize buff to make that do the damage as much as possible. I realized early on that my characters are not going to have a lot of damage, so I'm going to have to really rely on the buffs that you get in Imaginarium Theater to do a lot of damage for me. So proccing that as often as I can is going to help me out a lot. Especially if I can group them and then proc this damage on them. The reason also why I took Xinyan here over other characters is that I'm just using Xinyan for a little bit of shielding, but mainly to feed energy to Venti, which allows me to get my burst off a lot more consistently, and then just do more, and then group them so I can get that buff off more often and Hu Tao's burst on them. Yeah, so it's mainly the Abyss Blessing doing a lot of damage to these rather than my characters. As you'll notice, I did have to rewind here. For this, I got through this chamber and I was on to the next. I found I just didn't have enough damage, and the enemies that I'd picked to face weren't going to work with the characters I had, so I rewound, and luckily I got Sucrose, which is going to carry me through the next couple of chambers. This chamber specifically, there's 2 ways to deal with it. Either you group the characters and CC them enough so they don't do the damage, you either kill them really quickly so they don't do the damage, or thirdly, you just bait them. If you pick, I was doing a different run for this, and if you pick those secret source automatons, they're like robotic laser things, you can distract them really, really easily. And if you just buy your time and kind of stand around near them, attacking them, they'll just hang out with you, have a nice time, and not even bother about damaging the Monolith. So it allows you to pass this chamber really easily, even without having any CC that's necessary. It will take longer because killing enemies in this chamber decreases the time, but it still gets you a free pass, and it doesn't really matter which characters you take as long as you can distract those robots. Here I'm kind of taking a bunch of trash characters because the whole point is just to CC them, and Sucrose can kind of do that on her own. I knew this because when I looked for the enemies that I could pick, I saw that these enemies, it said, very easy to crowd control, or something along those lines. And so if it does say that, keep in mind that certain characters like Sucrose and Kazuha and Venti will be really effective in these chambers. You should always take a look at the different enemies that you can pick from, and pick enemies that are appropriate to the teams and characters you have. If you have a bunch of characters which are really good in single target, try to pick chambers with enemies that are single target. Even if that means you're skipping out on picking a character, or skipping out on re-rolling for a buff or something like that, right? Getting the right enemies is just as significant as getting a valuable buff. Even though I am getting rid of some trash characters, you can see I'm doing fine on this chamber. It's really quite forgiving. 35% health is really low, and so you have a lot of time. Even if some accidental damage does end up getting through, it's not going to have too much of an effect on your clear. Okay, so then I go on to pick two things. I pick up, first of all, a character, and I pick up Chivalrous. Now, I could have picked up Bennett here, probably, but I wanted to save Bennett till the end. Bennett is a crazy strong buffer, and he will essentially just let me, for free, clear any chamber just because he makes the rest of the characters so much stronger. Then I pick up a buff because getting that Vaporize buff up even higher is nice, and then I get a bunch of mystery caches. The mystery caches are they can give you some really cool effects, like regenerating a chamber, an energy to a character that you really needed. The biggest thing that happened here for me was I got extra energy on Barbara, which is useless. Barbara is not really a really valuable character for me. There's lots of other options. Well, I say that. I guess getting Barbara here allows me to get more Hydro characters, so it's easier to run Vaporize teams. And that does actually help me in this next chamber because I take Barbara as a character to Vaporize as the solo Hydro character. And even though she's not proccing her Hydro application a lot, it's enough, along with the grouping that Sucrose gives, to allow me to get past this chamber with some lesser characters, some characters that aren't going to deal as much damage. Especially my Yanfei, she's really not very well invested, but with the combination of Sucrose proccing the Vaporize buff and allowing it to hit all of those enemies, I managed to get through this chamber okay. Again, I knew the enemies that I'd be fighting would be groupable by Sucrose because I had a look at the description before I chose to fight them. And I chose to happily use Sucrose again, even though she's a really valuable character, because generally as it goes, earlier chambers will have more enemies, and later chambers, you're more likely to, first of all, fight bosses because you have less of those intermediary chambers as you get further down the theater. But secondly, you're more likely to, I think, to get elite chambers and more single target opponents, and Sucrose not going to do as well against those. So I don't mind using Sucrose up here, even though she is very valuable. The other nice thing about running multiple healers in this team, because I'm running Barbara and Sayu, who are both doing a lot of healing, I really don't have to worry about very much of the damage the enemies are doing. My characters will just survive, especially with the Yanfei shield. So we get through that easily enough and get the star. And then, knowing that the Papilla will be up kind of soon, I take Auron as my selectable character. So now we're on to our next climactic, the next boss, right? The next big showdown event. This boss is a boss that we've fought in the Abyss before. If you're really struggling with this and you want to know which characters to do stuff with, go check out the Abyss guide from 5.3, because I covered this boss a lot there, or whatever. And this is the Tyrant. The Tyrant's really annoying, and the boss works exactly like it does in Abyss, in that right away, as soon as the chamber starts, it will mess around for a minute before transforming into its little version where it gets a big pyro shield. I don't know if this shield's as big as in Abyss, but it's very annoying to deal with. And so I did try this a couple of times with just characters that could destroy the shield quickly, but I didn't have enough damage afterwards. So I ended up using my second instance of Xinqiu to get through this boss. As you can see, I destroy one of them and kind of wait next to the second because I then know it's going to definitely fly down next to this second one. Barbara applies Hydro on her attacks, and so she's able to target it really easily. And then Xinqiu's Rain Swords follow up and break that shield very quickly. Here, Heizo is not really here to do damage, or Heizo, sorry. He's just here to apply Viridescent Banner of Hydro, so that Xinqiu gets extra damage. With certain teams, you can double swell elements, so you reduce the resistance with Viridescent Banner to both Pyro and Hydro. But I can't be bothered with those complicated setups, and I think I have enough damage anyway, so I just ended up using Yanfei for most of the damage. Yanfei is getting some vaporizers, some nice charge attacks off. And this enemy has naturally higher pyro resistance, so Yanfei is going to be doing a little less damage as it is, so taking Hydro characters is even more significant against this. We get the star. I pick up another Hydro character so that I still have more backup Hydro characters, so I can get those Vaporize reactions still going, and then I pick a chamber knowing I have Xiangling backed up. Well, as an option to take against these enemies, which are Frost Heralds, I think. And the Frost Heralds are really easy to deal with if you have Xiangling or someone with really high pyro application, because all you really need to break is their shields. Xiangling has pretty high damage on her own, but even then, these enemies don't actually have that much health to them. As you can see, we wipe through their health pools really quickly. I don't know if that's just because I upgraded the Abyss Blessing a little bit, and it's now doing a lot of damage. We burn through those shields very, very quickly. Those health bars even. And then the shields themselves, we have so much. I think this was maybe the fastest chamber I did relative to the amount of time that I had remaining. You can see I'm not really doing anything else but just running around. Like, my attacks aren't doing anything because they're not applying any pyro. It's just Xiangling's Pyronado spinning around, breaking the pyro on their shields, and then let Guoba finish them off. Another star, another chamber down. We only have 4 left. I pick up Toma here because Lanyan is not going to make a significant difference based upon the elements I have so far. And I'll buy a mystery cast just because what else am I going to do with it? This lets me add 2 more characters back into the alternate cast so I can recruit them if I need to. And then I pick up Bennett, knowing that we're getting through to the last few chambers. I definitely want Bennett as an option to be able to use against these more difficult enemies. Ideally, I'll probably end up using Bennett against each of the bosses, and then I will use that middle chamber, just whatever I can pull together that's enough damage. We pick up Farazan again. Farazan, at C6, Farazan does a lot of damage, and especially with Heizo, she can make like fairly consistent Animo teams do a lot of damage. So against the Papilla, and the Papilla, Orion is really good against it. If you don't have a character with a Natlan ability like Chaska or Orion, you can also use Burning, you can use Hyper Bloom. It's a kind of awkward boss to deal with in Imaginarium Theater, because you can't really do Hyper Bloom, because there's no Dendro characters available to you. And you can't do Burning, because there's none of those characters available towards you. So you can do it with Moika, and Sid Lali also helps out. But if you can have access to an Orion or a Chaska, especially Chaska, if you take a support Chaska from someone on your friends list, she's really going to destroy this boss. Like, she breaks it so easily. Now, it did take me a few times to beat this boss because I didn't really listen to my own advice. If you notice the first second, the boss hasn't got its shield up. And so I kept using my Auron burst right away and wasting some of the charge of Auron's burst. So you should wait a second before using your abilities that do the most nice soul damage. I also tried this with a purely electro charge team, but I just didn't have enough damage, so we take Bennett and Chengling. Luckily, I had one energy left on Mona, so she was able to come along as a character to proc all the vaporizers and make the most of the Abyss Blessing. And then, after this boss, is when I used my second rewind. What happened was I went into the next chamber, and for the last chamber, I used up all my Hydro characters. And so I wasn't able to use this Hydro Vaporize Abyss Blessing that I really needed to do a lot of the damage for me. So I had to rewind and face some different bosses. Luckily, when I did rewind, I ended up hitting not only a lot more buffs, so I was able to use up all the currency I had, but I also hit a bunch of really good mystery caches, which gave me a lot more currency so I could get more buffs. Knowing what I would be facing later, I then took a bunch of Pyro characters into this chamber because I only had really a lot of Pyro characters to use. That means I got to save my Candace for the last chamber, and I used Auron along with all the Pyro characters to beat these lower Charles, hilly Charles, the big Charles, with the cryo shields, and their biggest asset is that they take a lot less damage when they have this big shield. So if I take all these Pyro characters, then I get to avoid that, and I was able to get through this chamber just by using a bunch of those characters that I'd saved up at the start. I think I also could have got away. My Chevy C6 here, which isn't actually giving any buffs because I'm not. Oh! I just realized on the watch through why I'm doing so much damage in this team. It's because I'm using an overload team. Okay, well there we go. I thought I just solved it perfectly. You know, everybody makes mistakes. Sometimes they're good ones. I realized why I'm doing so much damage in this chamber. Even then, I only just get it through it in the nick of time. But it's because I'm actually using an overload team, and so I'm getting all the Chevreuse buffs on all those characters. Okay, so then I have two relatively, not useless, but unimpactful characters to pick from. Here I'm just looking to get as many buffs as I can before I face that final chamber. And you can also read what the buffs do. Some of the different buffs apply amounts of elements. So if you're really wanting to trigger vaporizers, for example, you're playing Garming and you want Hydro to be on the enemy, so when you plunge, you do a vaporize. If you're picking a buff that is going to apply Pyro, which I think some of them can do to an enemy, that's going to steal your reaction. So you kind of want to make the most of. You actually want to read what the buffs do to pick the appropriate ones for your teams. So here I'm just picking up all of the Pyro Animo ones, because before the problem was I only had Pyro Animo characters left, but I don't feel that's really as effective here. Again, I'm picking ones that just add direct damage instead of really buffing my characters, because I'm not expecting the characters themselves to do a lot of damage. And thankfully, this is the final chamber. So, knowing the characters I have Garming still. I don't have a character that's going to apply Viridescent to debuff the enemy's resistances, because I think I only have Farah-san as my Animo character, so I pick up Lanyan anyway. And then I pick up Yunjin, but there's no other characters I can select, and there's no other buffs I can spend my currency on. Because I don't think I'm going to be swirling Hydro, because I have so limited Hydro characters. So we take Candace here. And so she applies Hydro at C6 when you do some normal attacks. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be plunging on Garming, doing some normal attacks while I wait for Manchai to come back to me. And then I'm going to be plunging on Garming to get those vaporizers. The combination of Bennett's shield, Lanyan's shield and Bennett's healing means we have quite a lot of survival. On top of that, Garming even heals himself a little bit. Candace also being on Instructors here is quite valuable because Instructors allows her to buff all of my team's Elemental Mastery, specifically Garming's Elemental Mastery, just before he wants to do some damage. Here I do some misplays with Lanyan and everyone. I could have probably just found the enemy right away and focused on them. So I waste like 10 seconds here, not really doing anything impactful. And it leaves me 16 seconds when this boss is weaker to try and blast them. If I'd have set up my bursts more appropriately, I would have saved a lot of time. And as you can see, during this run, I wasn't really paying that much attention. And so I end up actually missing the mark for the star by like 5 seconds, which would be easily recoupable if I played it properly. And I was so annoyed, I just ended the recording right there. I was like, I can't go back and replay this to get that last star. And I'm not doing that. So I just took what it was, and I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any feedback, let me know, and I'll see you for the next Abyss guide. Bye-bye!